The 250th anniversary is coming! Happy birthday, America!
Was the United States founded as a Christian nation, as so many social media posts and articles seem to indicate? What were the Founding Fathers' thoughts on this as they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Welcome to MewTube Undercover. Let us try and uncover the truths behind these ideas together. I am Perlock Holmes, and I will be your host. Let me turn this over to Professor Horatio Pawthorne, a distinguished scholar of American history, for his analysis.
Hello all, I am Professor Horatio Pawthorne. Was the United States founded as a Christian nation? A good question these days, with all the emphasis on social media about that being the bedrock of our nation. It feels good for many to hear that. I am a Christian myself, but I must step outside my feelings and look at this through the lens of the very founding fathers that birthed our great nation. So, in no particular order, let's look at 6 founding fathers and look into their writings on this important ideal. Franklin's most direct statement linking religion to the Constitution comes from his final speech on September 17, 1787. In it, he warns that religious sects often assume they possess absolute truth, and he urges the delegates to avoid that mindset when judging the Constitution. He said, quote, "Most men indeed, as well as most sects in religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that wherever others differ from them, it is so far error." End quote. He uses this observation to argue for intellectual humility among the delegates. His point? Just as religious groups can become dogmatic, political actors can too, and that dogmatism would make forming a workable constitution impossible. Franklin also believed that providence, as the colonial forefathers generally used in place of the word God, had a role in the framing of the Constitution. He wrote that he could, quote, "hardly conceive," end quote, that such an important event as drafting the Constitution would occur, quote, "without being in some degree influenced, guided, and governed by that omnipotent, omnipresent, and beneficent ruler," end quote. This shows Franklin's belief in a general divine oversight, not in establishing a religious government. Franklin was not anti-religion, but he was deeply skeptical of religious institutions seeking political power. His writings show several key principles. He said, "Good religion doesn't need government enforcement." He wrote, quote, "When a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. When it does not, and its professors are obliged to call for help of the civil power, 'tis a sign of its being a bad one." End quote. This is essentially Franklin arguing against government-backed religion. He believed in God, virtue, and moral living, but rejected dogma. He wrote, "Here is my creed. I believe in one God, that the most acceptable service we render him is doing good to his other children." End quote. He distrusted sectarian conflict. He noted that Christian sects historically persecuted each other, and that religion often, quote, "serves principally to divide us and make us unfriendly to one another." End quote. These views align with why Franklin supported a secular constitution, one that protects religious freedom without establishing a national church. In short, Franklin believed that religion should not be enforced by government. The Constitution should remain secular, protecting freedom of belief. Delegates should avoid the dogmatism common in religious sects when judging the Constitution, and providence may have guided the convention, but not in a way that justified a religious government. Next, let's move on to our first president, George Washington. George Washington's views on religion and the Constitution were publicly respectful, privately reserved, and politically deliberate. He believed religion was valuable for public morality, but he also insisted the new federal government must protect religious freedom and avoid establishing any national church. Washington rarely discussed theology, but he consistently argued that religion and morality were essential for civic virtue, the character needed for a republic to survive. He also made clear that the federal government must not impose or favor any religion. This dual position shaped early American policy. Religion was good for society, but government must not control religion. Washington was baptized and raised in the Anglican Church, later Episcopal. He served over 15 years as a vestryman and warden, a lay leadership role in Virginia's established church. He frequently used the term providence rather than explicitly Christian language, a term used by both Christians and deists. As an aside here, deism was a philosophy that was popular amongst many of the founding fathers. It is the belief in a creator God, but that God created the universe and nature and does not interfere after creating it. They believed humans come to know God through reason and the observation of nature, not through revelations, miracles, or sacred scriptures. Now that we understand what deism is, back to Washington's thoughts. Scholars note he rarely articulated specific doctrine, making his exact theology intentionally ambiguous. Washington's silence was itself political. He avoided sectarian conflict by avoiding sectarian statements. Washington did not write the Constitution, but as president of the convention, and later the first president, he strongly supported its religious neutrality. Key principles he endorsed were no national church. Washington supported the Constitution's ban on religious tests for office, Article 6. He reassured Americans that the federal government would not interfere with their religious practice, nor impose any religion. He believed in religious freedom, not mere toleration. Washington believed the U.S. should go beyond toleration, which implies permission from authority, and instead guarantee full religious freedom. He wrote repeatedly to religious minorities, Baptists, Quakers, Jews, affirming their equal rights under the Constitution. He urged religion as a support for public virtue. In his famous farewell address, Washington stated, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." End quote. This was not a call for a religious government. It was a call for a moral citizenry. Washington's presidency set precedents that defined American religious liberty. He signed the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment's protections for religious freedom. He issued proclamations invoking providence, but avoided endorsing any denomination. He wrote letters to religious groups, promising that the government would protect their freedom of worship. He emphasized that all faiths, or none, were welcome in the new republic. These are the clearest expressions of his philosophy. He said the government of the United States, quote, "gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance," end quote. This from his letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, 1790. On religion and morality, he said, quote, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle," end quote, from his farewell address, 1796. On pluralism, Washington praised America as a refuge for diverse religions and insisted the federal government must protect that diversity. In summary, George Washington believed that religion is valuable for public morality and civic virtue. The Constitution must remain neutral, with no national church and no religious tests. Religious freedom is a fundamental right, not a privilege granted by government. Providence may guide human affairs, but government must not enforce religious doctrine. Lastly, a diverse, pluralistic society is a strength, not a threat. His approach was practical, inclusive, and foundational to American religious liberty. We move on now to James Madison. James Madison's views on religion and the U.S. Constitution were the most intellectually rigorous and the most separationist of all the founders. If Washington embodied religious neutrality and Franklin embodied religious tolerance, Madison was the architect of full religious freedom, freedom from government-backed religion, and freedom for individual conscience. Madison believed that any alliance between religion and government is dangerous. This conviction came from witnessing religious persecution in colonial Virginia, where Baptist and Presbyterian ministers were fined and jailed for preaching without government licenses. That experience shaped his lifelong belief that government must not support, enforce, or privilege any religion, because doing so harms both religion and liberty. This influence produced Madison's most important work on religious liberty, the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, 1785, a foundational American document arguing that religion must remain entirely voluntary. Madison was the principal architect of the First Amendment, and his views shaped its meaning. Madison opposed even mild forms of state religious funding, such as taxes to support Christian ministers. He argued that religion is wholly exempt from government authority, that government involvement corrupts religion and violates natural rights. He was against any religious tests for office. Madison strongly supported Article 6's ban on religious tests. He believed political rights must never depend on religious belief. Madison insisted that religious freedom must apply to every religion, not just Christianity. He saw pluralism as a strength, not a threat. Madison's writings are some of the clearest defenses of religious liberty in American history. On government and religion, he warned that religious authority combined with state power leads to oppression, citing Virginia's history of jailing dissenters. Madison argued that true religion does not need government support, echoing Franklin's view, and that forced religion is both ineffective and unjust. Madison believed the First Amendment's purpose was to create a strict separation between church and state, protecting both. Madison's philosophy became the backbone of American religious liberty. Free exercise, no establishment, no religious tests, equal rights for all faiths. His views remain central to modern debates about religious freedom, as scholars note that Madison's early writings still help Americans understand the tensions between religion and public life today. In summary, James Madison believed, religion must remain entirely free from government control. Government-backed religion leads to persecution and corruption. Freedom of conscience is a natural right, not a privilege. The Constitution must protect all religions equally, without preference. The First Amendment requires a strict separation between church and state. Madison was the founder's strongest and most philosophical defender of religious liberty, the architect of the system we still live under today. Let's move on to John Adams, that patriotic firebrand who was so instrumental in stirring Boston and then the rest of the colonies into outright rebellion against the British Crown. John Adams's views on religion and the Constitution were a blend of strong moral traditionalism, personal theological independence, and firm support for religious liberty. He was more openly religious than Jefferson or Madison, but far less doctrinaire than many of his New England contemporaries. The sources show a consistent pattern. Adams believed religion and morality were essential for a republic's survival, but he opposed any federal establishment of religion. Adams famously argued that the American constitutional system could only function if the people themselves were virtuous. He said, quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." End quote. This is Adams's most quoted statement on religion and government. He did not mean the government should enforce religion, only that personal morality, often rooted in religion, was necessary for liberty to survive. Adams's theology evolved dramatically over his life. He was raised in strict Congregationalist Calvinism in Massachusetts that rejected predestination, original sin, and the Trinity. He embraced a rational Unitarian-style Christianity focused on morality and reason, and he believed religion should promote virtue, not dogma. Adams supported the Constitution's religious neutrality. He approved of Article 6, which bans religious tests for federal office. He supported the First Amendment, which forbids Congress from establishing a religion. Adams believed the federal government should not establish or enforce any religion, even though he personally valued religious practice. Adams frequently argued that religion and morality were essential to sustaining freedom. He wrote statesmen, quote, "may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand." End quote. This mirrors Washington's view that religion supports public virtue, but Adams expressed it more forcefully. Despite his moral traditionalism, Adams was firmly against any official national church. He was a champion of religious liberty at the federal level, a believer that religion should be voluntary, not enforced. However, Adams was not perfectly consistent. As a Massachusetts constitutional drafter, he did support state-level taxes for Protestant ministers, a holdover from New England tradition. This shows Adams was more comfortable with religion in local government than in the federal government. Like Franklin and Jefferson, Adams leaned toward deism. He believed morality must be grounded in belief in God, but he cared little about denominational differences. His faith was philosophical, not sectarian. In summary, John Adams believed, "The Constitution depends on a moral and religious citizenry, not on government-enforced religion. The federal government must remain neutral, with no national church and no religious tests. Religion is vital for public virtue, but must remain free and voluntary." His personal theology was rational, Unitarian, and anti-dogmatic. He supported religious liberty nationally, but tolerated some state-level religious establishments. Adams sits between Washington's civic religion and Madison's strict separationism, valuing religion deeply while resisting its entanglement with federal power. We move on to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's views on religion and the U.S. Constitution were the most philosophically radical of all the major founders. He championed absolute freedom of conscience, rejected government involvement in religion, and articulated the famous metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state. His ideas shaped the First Amendment more than any other founders, even though he was not physically present at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson believed religion should be entirely voluntary, private, and protected from government power. He argued that government should regulate actions only, not opinions, meaning belief is beyond the reach of law. This principle underlies his entire philosophy of religious liberty. A wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson coined this phrase in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists. It became a foundational concept in American constitutional interpretation and is cited by the modern Supreme Court. Jefferson meant a high and impregnable barrier preventing government from funding religion, enforcing religious doctrine, privileging one faith over another, compelling religious practice. Jefferson was deeply but unconventionally religious. He was a believer in a benevolent, rational God. He was a critic of orthodox Christian doctrines, Trinity, miracles, resurrection, and atonement. He was a follower of Enlightenment reason, influenced by Locke and Bolingbroke, and he even created the Jefferson Bible, using a razor, cutting out miracles and retaining only Jesus' moral teachings. He believed Jesus' moral and ethical teachings were without reproach, but he did not believe in miracles, nor in the divinity of Jesus. In summary, then, Jefferson was a deist because he believed in one God, in divine providence, in the divine moral law, and in rewards and punishments after death, but did not believe in supernatural revelation. He was a Christian deist because he saw Christianity as the highest expression of natural religion, and Jesus as an incomparably great moral teacher. He was not an Orthodox Christian because he rejected, among other things, the doctrines that Jesus was the promised Messiah and the incarnate Son of God. Jefferson's religion is fairly typical of the American form of deism in his day. Jefferson's private theology directly fueled his public commitment to religious liberty. Jefferson drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, 1777 draft, 1786 enactment. This is Jefferson's most important contribution to American religious liberty. The statute declared, "No person shall be compelled to support any religious worship. No person shall suffer on account of religious opinions. Civil rights do not depend on religious belief." This statute became a touchstone for interpreting the First Amendment. Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was in Paris. But he pushed strongly for a Bill of Rights to protect, quote, freedom of opinion, end quote. His ideas influenced James Madison, who drafted the First Amendment. His writings insisted that government should reach actions only, not opinions, a principle Madison incorporated into the free exercise and non-establishment clauses. Jefferson's philosophy shaped the Constitution indirectly but profoundly. Jefferson believed religion should be chosen freely, not imposed. Reason is the proper guide to religious belief. Government-backed religion corrupts both church and state. Freedom of thought is essential to both true religion and republican government. He told his nephew, quote, question with boldness even the existence of a God, end quote. This captures Jefferson's belief that faith must be sincere, not coerced. In summary, Thomas Jefferson believed, religion is a private matter between an individual and God. Government must build a wall of separation to protect religious liberty. True religion thrives without government support. The state should regulate actions, not beliefs. Freedom of conscience is a natural right. Jefferson was the founder's strongest advocate for strict separation of church and state, more radical than Washington, more philosophical than Adams, and more separationist than even Madison. Let's move on to that founding father who got his own Broadway play, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was raised Presbyterian, became Episcopalian, remained a believer throughout his life, and grew more devout in college, and again near the end of his life, especially after personal and political crises. He even proposed a little over a year before his death, creating a Christian constitutional society, a political organization grounded in Christian moral principles in 1802, though it never materialized. But like other Federalists, his public writings, for example the Federalist Papers, use broad terms like providence rather than sectarian language. This makes Hamilton more openly religious than Jefferson, Madison, or Franklin. Despite his personal devotion, Hamilton's public political writings, especially the Federalist Papers, use non-sectarian theistic language such as providence, creator, our Father. These terms were intentionally broad, compatible with many religions. This matches the Federalist tendency to avoid sectarian politics. Hamilton did not advocate for a Christian government. Instead, he supported the Constitution's religious neutrality. He wrote Federalist essays defending a government based on reason, structure, and checks and balances, not religious doctrine. Like Madison, he believed religious liberty was essential to preventing factional tyranny. Hamilton's constitutional thought was secular in structure, even if his personal faith was strong. The irony of Hamilton's scandals versus his religious devotion cannot be ignored. He was one of the most religious founders, especially in youth and late life. Yet he was involved in the Reynolds Affair, America's first major political sex scandal. His renewed devotion after the scandal is well documented. He sought moral reform and became more publicly aligned with Christian causes. This tension between moral aspiration and human fallibility is a defining feature of Hamilton's biography. Compared to other founders, Hamilton was more religious than Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and Paine, comparable to Washington and Adams in seeing religion as supportive of public virtue, unique in proposing a Christian political society later in his life, something no other major founder attempted. In summary, Alexander Hamilton believed religion was personally essential and socially beneficial. Government should remain religiously neutral but morally grounded. Providence guided human affairs, but the Constitution must rely on reason and structure. Christian moral principles could support civic virtue, though he never pushed for a national church. He was in many ways the founding era's religious federalist, devout in private life, non-sectarian in public life, and morally complex as a human being. Now, at the beginning of this video, I said I would look at 6 founding fathers and their thoughts on religion within the nascent constitutional republic that they were birthing. But in my research, I thought it prudent to mention one more man, Thomas Paine, an English-American writer and political pamphleteer whose Common Sense pamphlet and Crisis Papers were important influences on the American Revolution. He also wrote Rights of Man, a defense of the French Revolution and of Republican principles, and The Age of Reason, an exposition of the place of religion in society. Paine was not an atheist. He was a pure deist, believing in a creator, but rejecting all organized religion and all revealed scriptures. Paine believed God could be known only through nature and reason, not through priests, churches, or scripture. Paine viewed organized religion as corrupt, tyrannical, and anti-reason. Paine's criticism of organized religion was scathing and unprecedented among the founders. Examples from his writings include: Christianity is derogatory to the Almighty and repugnant to reason. Churches are human inventions designed to terrify and enslave mankind. My own mind is my own church. Religious tyranny is the worst tyranny. His attacks on Christianity and clergy were so severe that they destroyed his reputation in America after the Revolution. Only a handful of people attended his funeral. Paine's radical religious views inspired early debates about absolute freedom of conscience, influenced democratic movements in America and France, made him a hero of revolution, but a pariah in later American culture. Schools still avoid teaching him because of his anti-church writings. He remains the founding era's strongest voice for reason over revelation, individual conscience over church authority, and democracy over hierarchy. I don't think any more needs to be said about Paine's thoughts on religion. I merely put this in to illustrate that even his very radical views for his time were tolerated by the other founders. It clearly shows that the Founding Fathers shared wide beliefs on religion. Paine's thoughts were not merely non-sectarian, but openly hostile to Christianity and any other religion. I think that if you look at the founding of our republic, it was not founded on Christian values and was not created as a Christian nation. The Christian nation trope took hold particularly in the 1830s to 1850s, creating a mythos of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. The 1980s is when this ideal got its political consolidation under Ronald Reagan, linking Christian nationalism with conservative politics. In 1864, the motto, "In God We Trust," first appeared on the 2-cent piece, a reflection of the great test of the Civil War on American society. The phrase, "One nation under God," was not added to the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954, a reaction in part due to the aftermath of World War II, the Korean War, and the ongoing Cold War. So, if you have stayed through all of this, thank you. We hope this makes things clearer on the topic of our Founding Fathers and their relationship with God, country, and our all-important Constitution and Bill of Rights.